Chapter 10. Throughout my childhood, on Friday nights, whenever my father was away, which was often, he was a sports writer who traveled a lot for his work. My mother and I had an arrangement whereby I would take a bus downtown to meet her. She also worked for the local paper, and we would go to dinner at a cafeteria called Bishop's and then to a movie. I don't wish to suggest that my mother abused the trust I placed in her with regard to the selection process, but it did seem uncanny that the movies I favored had always just left town, and that we ended up seeing something involving murder, passion, and betrayal, usually starring Jeff Chandler, for whom my mother had a strange admiration, usually in a part that required him to spend a good deal of time bare-chested. "Oh," she would tut in a tone of shared chagrin, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea has just gone. But the Orpheum has the new Jeff Chandler movie, Tame Lust. Shall we go see that? I don't know if through the passage of time these movies have blurred into one in my memory, or whether they actually were all identical, but they seemed always to have the same elements. Way too much talking, lots of steamy embraces with Lana Turner or some other hard-looking blonde, very occasional gunfire resulting in a clutched belly, a staggered walk, and a disappointingly modest seepage of blood, and a part for Chandler that put him frequently on a speedboat or lifeguard stand dressed only in swimming trunks. Without even looking at the screen, you could tell which were the swimming trunks scenes because of the avidity with which my mother would begin to suck her lemon drops. If a Jeff Chandler movie wasn't available, and amazingly sometimes whole weeks passed in which he didn't produce a picture, we would have to see something else. Thus it was that one week when I was about 9, we went to see The Sundowners, a Technicolor epic starring Robert Mitchum and Deborah Kerr, in a story of a lovably feisty and indomitable couple making a life for themselves in the Australian bush. It was a memorable movie in many ways, not least that it provided the endearing spectacle of Robert Mitchum doing an Aussie accent, and that it dealt with Australia at all, which made it, in Hollywood terms, essentially unique. Nearly 40 years after the event, I don't recall much of the detail of the film other than that Mitchum and Kerr spent every waking moment herding armies of sheep and fighting one discommoding peril of antidopian life after another. Bushfires, dust storms, drought, locust infestations, and pub brawls mostly. It was also evidently very hot in Australia. Mitchum never spoke without first taking off a dusting hat and running a forearm across his brow. Since my plans for myself, even at the age of 9, were to spend my adulthood driving an open-topped sports car through Europe with Gene Seberg at my side, I concluded that Australia was of essentially zero interest and did not actively think about about it again for 30 years. In consequence, when finally I made my first trip down under to attend the 1992 Melbourne Writers' Festival, I was actually able to be astounded to find it there at all. I clearly recall standing on Collins Street in downtown Melbourne, so freshly arrived that I still smelled of, possibly even glistened of, from the insecticide with which the flight attendants sprayed the plane before arrival, watching the clanging trams and swirl of humanity and thinking, good Lord, there's a country here. It was as if I had privately discovered life on another planet or parallel universe where life was at once recognizably similar but entirely different. I can't tell you how exciting it was, insofar as I had accumulated any expectations of Australia at all in the intervening years. I had thought of it as a kind of alternative Southern California, a place of constant sunshine and cheerful vapidity of a beach lifestyle, but with a slight British bent, a sort of Baywatch with cricket, as I thought it. But this was nothing like that. Melbourne had a settled and gracious air that was much more European than North American, and it rained a whole week, which delighted me inordinately because it was so totally not what I had expected. What's more, and here we come to the real crux of things, I liked it straight off without quibble or doubt in a way I had never expected to. Something about it just agreed with me. I suppose it helped that I had spent half my life in America and half in Britain, because Australia was such a beguiling fusion of the two. It had a casualness and vivacity, a lack of reserve, a comfortableness with strangers that felt distinctly American but hung on a British framework. In their optimism and informality, Australians could pass at a glance for Americans, but they drove on the left, drank tea, played cricket, adorned their public places with statues of Queen Victoria, dressed their children in the sort of school uniforms that only a Britannic people could wear without conspicuous regret. I felt extremely comfortable with this. Almost at once, I became acutely and in an odd way delightedly aware of how little I knew about the place. I didn't know the names of the newspapers or universities or beaches or suburbs, knew nothing of their history or private achievements, couldn't tell a policeman from a postman. I didn't even know how to order coffee. It appeared that you had to specify a length, principally long or short, a color, black or white, and even an angle of orientation to the perpendicular, flat or not. And these could be put together in a multitude of permutations. Long black, short black, even long short black. My own preference, I discovered after many happy hours of experimentation, was flat white. It was a moment of the sublimest happiness. because my responsibilities at the festival were extremely slight. One or two stage presentations and a little light sweeping afterward. I was free to roam through the city, and I did so with the greatest enthusiasm and devotion, eavesdropping on conversations, sitting in coffee bars with all the morning newspapers and half a dozen beverages. I was still in the experimental stage, devouring both, reading labels and billboards and the signs in shop windows, asking questions of complete strangers. Excuse me, what's a Jackie How? What are nooks? What's an oka? I loved, still do, Australian voices, the lift and cadence, the effortlessly dry, direct way of viewing the world. At a reception for some minor awards presentation, the East Gippsland Young Farmers First Nobel Award or something, which I attended because I was just so pleased to get an invitation to anything and because cocktails were promised. I was standing with two female publicists from my publishers when some obviously self-infatuated bigwig breezed in. "Oh, look, it's Bruce Dazzling," observed one, and then with a kind of distant, perfectly encapsulating disdain added, "He'd go to the opening of an envelope." Someone else told me the story of an English friend of his who was flying to Australia when the stewardess tongued him a hot towel which proved upon application to be cold. So he told her, not in complaint, but simply because he thought she might want to warm them up some more. The stewardess turned to him and, smiling sweetly with only the tiniest trace of sarcasm, said, "Well, why don't you sit on it a bit? That should warm it up." I knew as soon as I heard that story that I was going to like this place. I haven't stopped yet. Because my first exposure was to Melbourne, I formed a certain slavish attachment to the place. I still find it terribly exciting to arrive in Melbourne. Not an emotion you will hear expressed often, but there you are, and driving now through the glossy high-rises of its central business district had something of the feeling of a homecoming. Over there was the first Australian hotel I'd stayed in. There, the first coffee shop I've tried. There, the celebrated Melbourne cricket ground, where I once spent 3 hours happily bewildered by an Australian rules football match and dined on my first and last 4-and-20 pie, made with real blackbirds, I was drolly assured. Insofar as such a statement could have meanings, this was my home in Australia. Most people, and when I say most people, I mean of course me when I first got here, don't realize that for a long time Melbourne was much the most important city in Australia. Although Sydney has been slightly the bigger of the two for nearly a century, Melbourne's population now is about 3.5 million to Sydney's 4 million. Melbourne was until relatively recently the center of things, particularly in the realms of finance and culture. Sydney used to compensate by making up cruel but generally outstanding jokes about Melbourne's supposed lack of liveliness. Like, do you have any children? Yes, 2 living and 1 in Melbourne. These days, Sydney makes jokes about Melbourne and steals its thunder, which is naturally a little hard for Melbourne people to take. Nothing better illustrates the shift in the two cities' relative standings than that in 1956 the Olympic went to Melbourne and in 2000 they have gone to Sydney. Most things do nowadays. In 1956, Melbourne was headquarters to 50 of Australia's largest companies, while Sydney had just 37. Today, the proportions are almost exactly reversed. A generation ago, international companies routinely chose Melbourne for their Australian headquarters. Today, over 2/3 opt for Sydney. But far more galling to a city that has always viewed Sydney as having the intellectual vibrancy of, let us say, daytime television. Melbourne has had to watch as Sydney has appropriated chunks of its cultural preeminence in publishing, fashion, film and television, all the performing arts. I used to visit my Australian publishers in Melbourne. Today I go to Sydney. Having said all that, and once you strip out the huge visual advantage Sydney derives from its harbour, there is precious little to choose between the two in terms of quality of life or cultural satisfaction. Much less separates Melbourne from Sydney than separates Los Angeles from New York or Birmingham from London. Melbourne may not have a harbour bridge or an opera house like Sydney's, but it has something in its way no less singular. It has the world's most bizarre right turns. If you are driving in central Melbourne and you wish to go right, and bear in mind that you're driving on the left, you don't get in the middle lane, but rather pull over to the left-hand curve as far away as possible from where you want to be and sit there for an indeterminate period, in my case until all the clubs and restaurants have shut and everyone has gone home for the night, and make your turn from there. It's all to do with keeping out of the way of the trams, Melbourne's other specialty, which go down the middle of the road and can't have turning cars blocking their way. It's immensely confusing, not only to visitors from overseas but to other Australians, even, I suspect, to many Melbourne people. But what really sets Melbourne apart is its love of Australian rules football, a sport little followed in Sydney or New South Wales, where rugby is the passion. It's interesting that Melbournians don't tell jokes about Sydney. They tell jokes about their beloved footy, to wit. A man arriving for the grand final in Melbourne is surprised to find the seat beside his empty. Tickets for the grand final are sold out weeks in advance and empty seats unknown. So he says to the man on the other side of the seat, "Excuse me, do you know why there is no one in this seat?" "Oh, it's my wife's," answers the second man, "but I'm afraid I'm afraid she died. That's terrible. I'm so sorry. Yes, she never missed much. But couldn't you have given the ticket to a friend or relative? Oh no, they're all at the funeral. I was on my way to meet an old friend named Alan Howe, who it so happens is the person who introduced me to the transfixing peculiarities of Australian rules. I first met him nearly 20 years ago when I was working as a copy editor on the business desk of the Times in London, and he was a downy-faced recruit from down under. I had been there for a few months already when he arrived and was given a seat beside me on the copy desk. I don't want to say he was awfully young back then, but he was wearing a Cub Scout uniform. I took him under my wing as a fellow colonial and taught him all I knew. Admittedly, this was only 3 things: that Lloyd's of London had an apostrophe, while Lloyd's Bank did not, that the hyphen was oddly placed in the company names Rio Tinto Zinc, and that staff cafeteria was in the basement, but in those days that was all you needed to know to work on the business desk.